That was Dr. John Andrews, personal physician to Osho, who was formerly known as Rajneesh, but now they prefer the name Osho. Quite a controversial figure in his day, but Phil, I thought John did a wonderful job explaining the story and telling the sort of the behind the scene story, at least from his version of it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. Osho was one of the more interesting of the gurus who came here in the 70s and 80s, and certainly the most iconoclastic and irreverent of the lot. He compared him to Krishnamurti, which was an interesting comparison because they were both iconoclastic and both anti-organized religion and both anti-guru and anti-tradition. Krishnamurti, however, was very staid and proper.
Hmm.
And Rajneesh, or I should, Osho, was hardly that.
Right, right. It sounded like he gave people a lot of freedom. I do think the one point he made about sitting meditation and sitting quietly. It's very difficult for a lot of people in the West. His meditation, which I'm not so familiar with, seems radically different into a meditation sort of action of movement. I do know one person who does practice his meditations on a regular basis and seems to get a lot out of it. And I've heard
Yeah,
really good things about his ashram in India. People that have gone there, it's supposed to be very beautiful and well kept and all that. And like you said, they have fun. Uh, one thing though, Phil, next time we talk, I'd like to ask him when he says they learn to watch. I wonder if that's similar to what people are trained to do in mindfulness
yeah. It
meditation.
sounds like it does sound like Vipassana meditation. I don't know enough, but this business of people finding it difficult to do sitting meditation. I mean, people like you and me, before anybody ever heard of Osho, were sitting meditation, and our lives were transformed.
Hmm.
So there may be some validity to it, but um, my caveat would be, or my counter argument would be, if you learn a good method of sitting meditation, uh, it's not difficult. In fact, it's quite easy, as we learned when we were practicing TM even in the 60s.
Hmm.
And so I don't know that that's true.
Well,
It may be true. It may be true for people who don't have a proper method, but just try to sit still.
yeah.
On the other hand, um, the whole tradition of doing yoga asanas and pranayama before meditation is for that same reason. It's to settle the
Right.
body so that sitting meditation is in fact
Well,
not as difficult. So
I would say this. I mean, I loved meditation from the get-go. I learned transcendental meditation, did it. It was 20 minutes twice a day, whatever. And in the beginning, it was very difficult, for me to sit that period of time. I was a very active person, and I've taught a lot of people meditation. They all loved it, but many people, I'd say the majority, don't do it regularly after a short period of time.
yeah,
And the reason being is it's one of the reasons being not because they don't like it, because they always like it, because they just don't feel comfortable sitting that long. And when I did courses where I did hours of meditation in a day, I felt I got great benefit from it. But the sitting part for hours each day was a lot more difficult for me than for some people, and then I know other people it was
yeah.
even more difficult for them. So I think you had the whole range, and I think different things work better for different people.
Yeah,
And
and the image of as I said, there were there that's why the emphasis has been so much on hatha yoga in recent decades, and why when
hmm
even in the 70s when we were teaching TM and weekend residence courses, the physical practices of asana and breathing pranayama practice were an integral part of it. And that integration of physical and mental practice is a very, very old tradition. Osho took it to a different level, and he had a lot of very young people, a lot of them, sort of hippies from the 70s, and very young and vital, and maybe sitting in meditation, or at least the way they were doing it, was in fact difficult, or there was a need to burn off some of that energy,
Mm-hmm.
and just sort of let loose, and then the sitting. And what's interesting is the image, because there were a lot of attempts at exposés of gurus back in those days,
Mm-hmm.
and there was so much surrounding Osho, who was then called Rajneesh, with the Rolls Royces and
Right.
the communes and the. Well, one thing we didn't get into with John was there were a lot of sexual stuff going
Right.
on, sort of free sexuality stuff that got a lot of attention, and so you'd see images of people jumping and dancing and moving their bodies in crazy ways, like some kind of Pentecostal thing, or
Right. Right.
drug-induced hypnosis. But what they didn't show was that would be followed by silence,
Mm-hmm.
and the sort of purging of this excess energy in movement had a method to it.
Right. There was a
that
method to
resulted.
a method to the madness. And
Yeah.
one of the other things that came out in speaking to John today about Osho and his teachings and all, it's one thing to come out with teachings. It's another thing to come out with a functional movement organization. Whether he's directly involved or not. I think all gurus always say they're not directly involved, but usually they are, and it often becomes dysfunctional. People get caught up in the material end of it. Like you said, the Rolls Royces were going around, and Osho may have had nothing to do with that. But there's a lot of distortion that takes place, and
Yeah.
we see it time and time again in observing, especially in a guru-centric movement, that the organization also becomes dysfunctional.
Yeah, and in this case, the dysfunction, ended up with jail sentences for Sheila,
Yeah.
and Rajneesh, or then called Rajneesh Osho, having to uh, be investigated by the immigration
Yeah.
officials in the U.S. and cut a deal. They wanted him to leave,
Yeah, he
essentially,
left,
and there was a deal was cut. Now, we'll never know to what extent Osho may have been involved in some of those deeds that were, or dysfunctions, or how to the extent his followers are right when they say he was just sort of removed from all that. And it's true, he went into silence during a lot of that period in Oregon, and a lot of stuff probably went on outside of his attention. At the same time, other people will say, well, he was in charge and the buck stops with him, and there's all validity. But be that as it may, one of the things I discovered, because I was vulnerable to the same images of him that many of us had back then, when I was researching American Veda, I interviewed people who were with him at the time, not as closely perhaps as John Andrews, but others. And, he was teaching very brilliantly high-level philosophy, combining Western philosophy and traditional Indian philosophy, and methods that transform people's lives for the better. So, and people 30, 40 years later, very grateful to him as their teacher.
Right.
And we should not overlook that in the midst of, the sensationalism that went on.
Yeah, I mean, he studied in university. He was well educated. I think he did study philosophy, religion. He had a
He was a
B.
professor.
Yeah, he had so he had quite a good academic background, And I've
Hmm.
heard it's easy to look at any group, whether it was the Hare Krishna or whomever, and say, well, let's kind of they're at the airport. This thing is just crazy. But usually, when you look into it, there's something of substance there, and there's no
Yeah, yeah,
question in his case there was. And I don't know much about the philosophy or even the practices, but look, they have this. They have supposed to have an amazing place in India. Do know people that have visited it in Pune, India,
yeah.
and it's
And
been
you
around
know,
for a long time.
one thing should be said for him. You know, in addition to what I already said about having a positive effect on people's lives, there was a lot of controversy and a lot of stuff went on that deservedly was condemned by people. But I haven't run into people who were angry at him or felt exploited by him,
Right.
or taken advantage of or anything like that. Maybe they exist, but I haven't run into them.
Yeah, the people I've spoken to, and it's been a handful, uh, have had good experience. And I know one person practicing the meditation still. He likes it very much. But I think, he probably had some good message and
Yeah.
and some effective techniques. But of course, organizationally, it was sort of a disaster in the United States. And then now they've regrouped and they're set up in India. And I think probably quite functional.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think there are centers in the U.S. still as well. I'm sure
do
people
they
if they're
proselytize?
can
Are they
find.
trying to grow their numbers of practitioners? It sounded like everything was available right online.
Yeah, but I think there are Osho communities and maybe teachers. I don't know, but there's many followers in the U.S. and many of them live in not in communes, but in places where they can associate with each other and so forth.
Well, Phil, this was another very interesting interview. Dr. John Andrews, originally from England, living in India, the personal physician of Osho, who was known back in the day as Rajneesh. And it amazes me all the different tales of groups seeking enlightenment, and it's good to know they're all out there. And stay tuned, and we'll uncover and go into each and every one. Please
Okay.
tell your friends. Spirit Matters can be found at www.spiritmatterstalk.com. We're a podcast. We're on iTunes. We're on SoundCloud. We're on social media, and get your friends to listen. I'm watching looking at the analytics, and our numbers are growing in terms of listeners, and we have people listening from all over the world, and we hope we bring them some good knowledge.
Okay, Dennis.
Next time.
Bye.